folks. Thanks very much for joining our Monday Mindshare. Well, the Northern Hemisphere, of course, things are ramping down as things start cooling off. And in the Southern Hemisphere, of course, it's ramping up as things start warming up. The next 4 weeks, I want to run two parallel four-part series, one for the Northern Hemisphere and one for the Southern Hemisphere. The first topic for the Northern Hemisphere is going to be about off-season experience breakfasts. And this is all about keeping the weight off and keeping the fat ox up. On the Southern Hemisphere, we're going to be talking about summer racing and the ramping of racing down there, and specifically a race recipe for each of the 4 weeks: the marathon, the Ironman, the ultra marathon, and the 70.3 half Ironman. So we're going to cover a recipe of fueling for each of those type of races. Well, this weekend, it's the New York City Marathon, it's the Noosa Triathlon down in Australia, and it's the Florida Ironman on today also. So there is racing going on everywhere, but it's different to where you are all around the world. Big congratulations to our own Zach Bitter last weekend, finishing 5th in the Javelina 100, which is the 100-miler there in Arizona. 13 hours 34 to check in on his race finish. Check out all the details of his race fueling on his Instagram page. He's got it all there, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. So let's jump in firstly to the off-season breakfast. This is part one of part four, or four-part series, I should say. And okay, so we're nearing the off season. There still could be some running going on, of course, as things get cool, a lot of marathon running going on, but it is cooler weather. And sometimes this triggers some bad habits where the carbs begin to float upwards, and so does the weight. And we want to avoid this. It's really easy to do. Breakfast is such a critical piece of that. There's a prior video I did on why breakfast matters. Check it out up here, or up here, I think it's the link for YouTube. You can check that out, and why it matters and how it impacts the rest of the day in terms of your blood sugars and, of course, your energy levels. So for the next 4 weeks, we'll cover 4 quick and easy experience breakfasts and a few refinements to keep the fat oxidation high and the weight gain low. So first breakfast, it's really a staple. This one is your classic scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee. It's quick, it's easy, but you can really mess it up if you do it wrong in terms of blunting fat oxidation. You can make some very simple refinements to really have it, really upregulate fat oxidation, keep you satisfied, keep your energy up for the morning, and keep your weight off for the winter. So let's talk about the eggs first. Well, firstly, I see a lot of times when people think about eggs and, things around it for the meal, is they end up with just one egg and then they surround it with a ton of other foods, and it's usually carbohydrate that sits around it. Well, I want you to actually reverse this. We're going to start with the eggs and be thinking 2, 3, 4 eggs. Remember that these are only 7 grams of protein per egg. It's not a lot, and you actually need quite a bit to start off your day. They are heavy in fat, saturated fat, and that's okay. This is what's going to make you feel satisfied, to have both the protein and the fat. But as I said, fill up more on the eggs than compared to what you put around the eggs. Don't get this wrong. Scramble it up or poach the egg, and do that with some olive oil and salt it, of course. Now, the options for around the egg. Now, if time is a factor, which it usually is, think 2 or 3 small tomatoes. If you've got a bit more time, you can chop up some mushrooms, some spinach. But again, warm all this up in the olive oil. Again, don't overcook it. You shouldn't be blackening things. You should just warm them up in the olive oil and put all of that, of course, with your eggs. And don't throw away the oil. Pour the oil over the top of the eggs, or the mushrooms, or the tomatoes, or the spinach, etc. It's that fat that's going to help you keep energized and satisfied for the rest of the morning. Now, I'm going to talk bread and toast. Now, this is usually something that we'd say keep away from. And, generally, the volume of cereals is a problem. So here's what I want you to do. There's nothing essentially wrong with it. Obviously, if you have a gluten insensitivity, that's a problem. You're going to have to choose a gluten-free bread. But in either case, it's whole grains. It's ideally from a bakery. And what my best practice recommendation is if you're buying a loaf, is you buy it, you slice it, and you freeze it. And the reason I say that is if you have a fresh loaf sitting on the bench, the tendency to be using it through the day, i.e. multiple slices per day, is where the problem begins. This is about taking a half of a single slice that you're going to have with your eggs and whatever surrounds your eggs. If you don't want it, fine. But for those of you who do want it, keep it to a half a slice a day. And as I said, whole grain from the bakery, ideally get it sliced there. And once you get it home, put it in the freezer. And just use the half a slice when you have this particular breakfast. Now, again, after you toast it, cover it with olive oil. That's what's going to help, again, mix up the fiber and the complex carbohydrate and the fat together with the egg. It's going to be quite a slow release of glucose from the digested carbohydrate through your stomach and into the blood system. So there's no problem with that. It's good to have the fiber. It's complex carbohydrates. And again, with the egg and with the olive oil, it's going to be a fairly slow release. Now let's talk about the coffee or the tea that you have with this. You know, you choose what the format is or the type you have. It's kind of a religious thing, what people like in terms of coffee and how you take it. It's really quite personal. But again, it's important to add the fat, whether that is a full cream that you add to that. And that is what's going to, again, support the overall satiety for the morning. It's obviously going to also give you the energy in the way of those fats. To make it super creamy and really with healthy fats and glutamine, I encourage you to put a scoop of the SFuels Transform in there, whether that's a latte, whether that's a cappuccino or what have you. But that's certainly going to give you a whole new level of creaminess that you may not have experienced before. And it's healthy fats with the MCT fats, and it's also a good dose of the glutamine. Now, if you're a tea drinker, green tea, or if it's if you're a little concerned on the caffeine factor, some people are sensitive to it in the morning, use a white tea. But both green tea and white tea have a good concentration of the polyphenols. This is the ECGCs, as they refer to them, the acronym of these polyphenols responsible for triggering fat oxidation and lipolysis, the breaking down of fatty tissue. So that's how I would optimize that particular staple breakfast for the morning. Check it out. We're going to add 3 more breakfasts over the next 3 weeks. Now let's dive across to the Southern Hemisphere where racing is ramping up. We're first going to do a recipe for marathon racing. And this still applies, of course, to the Northern Hemisphere where there's still a ton of racing going on, both triathlon down in the southern part of the Northern Hemisphere, so think Florida and these parts, but in the northern parts of the Northern Hemisphere, if there is any racing, it's marathon and ultras. So let's talk about, we're going to split each of these times we talk about a recipe for a race, whether that's an Ironman, a half Ironman, ultra, or today, the marathon. We're going to split it into the night before, race morning, and then during the race. So with all of these recipes, the 3 principles that we're seeking to achieve is to avoid bonking. In other words, stable energy for the whole race. This is not some type of, good energy at the start of the race and it trickles down as you go through the race. It needs to be stable through the race. And we're going to do that by having a good, sound metabolic flexibility between burning fats and burning carbohydrate. Secondly, to finish stronger by preserving glycogen for the latter part of the race so that you can finish stronger. And then thirdly, we're going to avoid number one reason why most athletes, when they have to stop in these races, it's not because of sore muscles, it's not because you're tired, it's because of gut distress. That's still the number one reason for not finishing these races. Okay, let's start on the night before. You want to take a quality, easy protein. What does this mean? This means largely not red meat. Red meat is very heavy on the digestive system. It's taxing on the body. It takes away energy. It's a quality protein, no question. But the night before a race, it's not the most ideal. Think fish, think chicken, eggs, sushi. These types of proteins are much simpler to digest. They're lower tax in terms of energy required to digest it on the body. It sits better in the system allows for a good night's rest rather than heavy digestion through the night. Now, starch. This is not about carbohydrate loading. What we should have been doing through this week is adding a little bit more starch through the week prior to the race. But the night before, think of a small serve of complex form of carbohydrate. So think about rice or sweet potato. And ideally, you want to cook this and then let the temperature slightly come off it a bit, meaning like cook it, put it on the plate, and let it slightly cool. That doesn't mean let it go cold. It's just have it warm, not hot. It's just going to change a little bit of the starch so that it's not all non-resistant, but some of it will actually retrograde back to a more resistant starch, and you won't have this big hit and heavy blood sugar release. It's going to be much slower into the blood supply by doing that. So again, just cook the starch, slightly let it cool, and then have that with your protein. If after that you're still feeling like something a little sweet, add a little bit of fruit, think berries with 2 or 3 tablespoons of Greek yogurt. That's certainly going to also help you rest in the night. And try to avoid the very high glycemic type of fruits, banana, mango, pineapple, apple. These things. Stick with the berries. Just keep it small. It's enough just to keep you satisfied for that night before. The obvious things to avoid in the night before, alcohol should go without saying, but not always. Desserts and juices, sodas, ice creams, caffeine, cookies. You want to avoid these things. You really don't need them the night before race day. All right. It's the morning of race day. We wake up. First thing, if you haven't already done it, start preparing your SFuels primed. This is going to be what you use in that first hour of the race. So take one of our bullets or something similar, whatever the small soft flask or whatever it is you're going to have in your race belt or in your vest or in your suit, and basically put 2 of the SFuels primed, mix it with some water, and put the bullet in your suit or in your vest or your belt. Put that aside. Okay, breakfast. Again, easy protein. Think a little with a little fat, maybe some eggs, could be some SFuels cereal, could be one of our Life Bars, something like that. But basically, very low on carbohydrate. You can take a little bit. You can have like a couple of slices, 3 or 4 or 5 slices of banana. That's fine. But it's not a big dose. And by not being a big dose, you're not going to have a big reaction. But always have it with some protein and fat. That's what's really important on race morning. A little bit of milk, a little bit of cream, that's fine. And of course, whether you're a coffee or tea drinker, leave it up to you what your preference is. Make sure you test all of this in training. Have this, the time it's going to be from when you have the breakfast on race day to race start. Work out what that's going to be for your marathon and plan accordingly in training and simulate that and test some of these different if you will, marathon race meals, breakfast meals, and see what works best for you. Now, starting the primed. This is separate to the bullet that you prepared earlier. This is a separate drink, and you should be having this in a throwaway bottle that you're going to take between leaving the house or the home where you are and you're heading to the race start. That hour to 2 hours before the race is when you're going to be sipping on 1 serve of the SFuels Train mixed with 1 serve of the SFuels Primed. At least you should be taking 1 serve of the SFuels Primed if you just want to keep it simple. But you should be in that hour to 2 hours before race start is be sipping on something like that. It's going to keep you hydrated, helps actually even deal with some of the nerves. Most importantly, it helps get the cognitive readiness to embrace the race. And then lastly, in terms of avoiding things on that race morning, all of your high carbohydrate cereals, breads, baking, juices, candy, gels, avoid all of that. Our Race Plus product, avoid that. You shouldn't be having that prior to race start on race morning. You don't want any high density and large amounts of high glycemic carbohydrates on race morning. That's just going to blunten your fat oxidation. That's the last thing you want to do. Again, we want to set you up for metabolic flexibility for your race so that you're burning fat and carbohydrate really well through the race. So avoid those things. Okay, the gun goes off, race start. I would suggest the first 10 minutes is just relax into your race pace. Just get into the groove of the race pace. Enjoy the race and just get into the speed and make sure you feel how your body feels for the day. Now think about in that next, after that first 10, 15 minutes and up to 30 minutes is when you're going to take your SFuels primed that you put in the bullet. These are 2 serves that you put in the bullet or one of your soft flasks that you have in your vest or belt or your race suit. And you're going to drink and sip that primed in that period of, after the first 10 minutes of race start up to 30 minutes into the race. So you got about a 20-minute window, and it's not critical exactly, but around that, in that first 30 minutes, you want to have had this SFuels prime, the 2 doses. That effectively then has 3 doses by the time you're 30 minutes into the race. You had 1 before you started the race in that hour to 2 hours before the race, and then you had 2 more serves out of that bullet that you were carrying in the race in that 10 to 30 minutes. This is what's going to upregulate your fat oxidation. It's going to put it on a new level, and you'll be really effectively burning fat. Now, to this point, we've done nothing in terms of taking carbohydrate for the start of the race. Even the next 30 minutes, so in other words, the first hour of the race, I would avoid taking on carbohydrate. Let the body begin to get into the groove and the upregulation of fat, and it will begin to burn fat, carbohydrate. It's really at that point, at 30 to 60 minutes, where you can take on some water. There's no need for fuels and gels and bananas and aid station fuels or drinks. Stick with the water and get your body into the groove of using its own fuel for that first 60 minutes of the race. Now, we get into 60 minutes and beyond, the rest of the race. This is where you're going to start adding carbohydrate, and we're going to use the Race Plus, the starches. We're avoiding the fructose, and we're avoiding the glucose, etc. You want to be targeting 45 to 60 grams per hour. The maximum amount of glucose your body can burn is 1 gram of glucose per minute, 60 grams per hour. So somewhere between 45 and 60 grams per hour is our recommendation of the Race Plus drink. Well, what does that mean? That means you've got to mix either 3 or 4 serves of Race Plus per hour of racing. If you don't do a 4-hour marathon, then you need to do 16 serves into a soft flask, and that's going to be a concentrate. You put the concentrate in your vest or in your suit or in your race belt, and you basically be sipping on that every 10 minutes. Ideally, what you want to do is take your soft flask, and if you're doing a 4-hour marathon, divide your soft flask in 4, so that then you should be going through a quarter of that each, 10 kilometers each quarter of the race. If it's a 5-hour marathon, divide your soft flask into 5, and you should be going through that 5th of the soft flask for each hour of the race. Now, as you go through the aid stations, this is where you're going to take on the water to keep yourself hydrated, and you'll have to know from your training and the expected conditions for the actual race location, how much water you need to take on. And that's what training is all about, to test and understand and to get familiar with how much water for you need to take on. So you really want to just keep sipping that Race Plus then for the rest of the race. Like I said, it is a concentrated Race Plus formula that sits in a soft flask, and just mark off your soft flask based on the hours for the race and keep taking it in as you go through the race. Hopefully that helps you in the Southern Hemisphere or the Northern Hemisphere, wherever you're racing, your marathon. We're going to do more of these. Next week, we'll do the Ironman. Week after that, the Ultra. And then the week after that, we will do the half Ironman. All the very best for you wherever you are around the world. And as always, go longer. Thanks for joining. Talk soon.